In the endless steppes of Mongolia, more than 8 centuries ago, a personal tragedy spiraled into one of history's most calculated campaigns of sexual violence. The man the world would one day call Genghis Khan first tasted the bitterness of helplessness when his beloved wife, Borte, was kidnapped, assaulted, and returned carrying another man's child. This singular wound became the seed of an empire's darkest weapon, transforming private shame into a continental policy of domination. What began as the humiliation of one man grew into a machinery of conquest that weaponized women's bodies as instruments of terror. The Mongol conquests were never just about gold, grazing lands, or fortresses. They became about obliterating entire bloodlines, erasing enemies through the very wombs of their women. This isn't a tale safely sealed in dusty chronicles. It is the story of how personal trauma, when fused with absolute power, reshaped the genetic map of half a continent. How one woman's abduction set in motion centuries of cruelty, and how another woman's act of vengeance finally broke the chain. The proof survives not only in ancient manuscripts, but in our very DNA. 1 in every 12 men across Asia today carries the genetic imprint of Genghis Khan. What you're about to hear will strip away the comforting distance we keep from history. It shows that some of the worst atrocities are born not in battlefields, but in private grief, and that they spread until entire civilizations are scarred. This is one of history's darkest chapters, where sex became strategy, wombs became battlegrounds, and survival meant choosing between death or a fate many considered worse. The year was 1162 when a boy named Temujin, later Genghis Khan, was born into a world where stealing brides was as common as stealing horses. On the Mongolian steppe, strength dictated survival. Women were bargaining chips in alliances, vengeance, and feuds. Temujin's own mother had been abducted by his father, a story so ordinary among the tribes that it barely earned a mention in the oral histories. But the steppes were changing. Tribal confederations were growing larger. Raids became more brutal, revenge bloodier. Old customs that once restrained violence were breaking apart. In this ruthless world, Temujin learned early that power was not something inherited. It had to be taken, often over the dead bodies of rivals. His childhood was a crucible of loss. His father was poisoned by enemies. His clan abandoned his family to die. For years, he and his siblings scraped out survival in hunger and desperation. Betrayal became his first tutor. Mercy, to him, was nothing but weakness. By 1178, he had clawed his way from the margins of survival to the position of a minor chieftain. That year, he married Borte. For Temujin, this was not just a love match, but a step toward legitimacy. Borte came from a respected family, bringing dowry and powerful connections he desperately needed. For a moment, it seemed as if the cycle of violence that had shaped his childhood might pause. Then came the Merkits. This tribe bore an old grudge. Years earlier, Temujin's father had stolen a bride from them. Now, by the brutal logic of steppe justice, the Merkits would reclaim their honor through Temujin's wife. At dawn, the raiders struck. Hooves thundered through the camp. Smoke and screams filled the air. Temujin faced a choice that would define him forever: stand and fight against impossible odds, or flee and live for vengeance. He chose survival, abandoning Borte to her captors. For 9 months, she remained their prisoner, taken as the wife of another warrior. When Temujin finally rallied enough allies to rescue her, she returned pregnant. The arithmetic was merciless. The child could not be his. On the steppes, this was the deepest humiliation. A man who could not defend his wife's womb could not defend his people. Yet Temujin did something unexpected. He accepted Borte back and raised the child, Joki, as his own. Outwardly, it was a gesture of strength. Inwardly, it was a scar that never closed. Joki would grow up under suspicion, his legitimacy questioned by his brothers, his father's affection forever uncertain. Those who knew Temujin noted a change after Borte's ordeal. The flashes of leniency he once showed vanished. Where he once spared enemies, he now demanded annihilation. The man who had failed to prevent his wife's violation became determined to control the fates of countless others. Modern psychology would recognize this as trauma crystallized into domination, but for the millions who would later endure Mongol cruelty, the psychology mattered less than the consequences. Temujin had learned that in a predator's world, the only way to survive was to become the ultimate predator. The most beautiful were claimed by Khan himself or reserved for his generals. The rest were allocated to soldiers according to rank. Common warriors received shares based on their bravery in battle. This was not random chaos, but a cold bureaucracy. Mongol law codes even spelled out how many women each rank could receive, what penalties awaited those who exceeded their allotment, and how the process was to be recorded. Scribes kept careful accounts of who received whom. It became a ledger of human suffering stretched across half the known world. Special units were tasked with rounding up women after a conquest, while others executed men. Techniques were refined, examining teeth to judge age, hands for signs of nobility, hymens for virginity. Women were branded, tagged, and processed. Logistics officers arranged their transport, setting up way stations where human captives could be reassigned along the empire's arteries. The Mongols even established what later scholars call comfort battalions, mobile brothels that trailed the army. These were not makeshift arrangements but planned structures, complete with overseers, guards, cooks, and physicians. Women were inspected for disease, rationed food, and guarded against escape. It was sexual violence industrialized, integrated into military infrastructure. Within these camps, hierarchies mirrored the empire's obsession with order. Women were classified not as people but as resources, distributed like plunder and controlled with the same cold efficiency as weapons or horses. Women from noble bloodlines often became senior wives to Mongol officers, forced to manage households that included dozens of other captured women. Some adapted to this grim reality, carving out small privileges by serving as intermediaries between captives and their overlords. The entire system ran with grotesque efficiency. Women were stripped of their names and given numbers. Their days were scheduled like military drills, except their duties revolved around servicing soldiers. Quotas were sometimes enforced. Women could be required to submit to a certain number of men daily. Resistance was punished brutally, ranging from deliberate starvation to mutilation. Pregnancy became both a curse and, at times, a reprieve. Pregnant women were sometimes set aside until after childbirth, but this reprieve was temporary, as their infants often became another cog in the Mongol machinery of control. The Mongols understood that domination wasn't only physical. To break their captives fully, they forced women to participate in their own humiliation. Victims were compelled to cook for their abusers, mend their clothing, and even sing native songs for entertainment. Psychological torture walked hand in hand with physical degradation, erasing not only resistance but identity itself. Escape was almost impossible. Camps were deliberately established far from native homelands, isolated on the vast steppe where flight meant near certain death from exposure. When escape did occur, the Mongols sometimes allowed one survivor to return, but only after brutal torture, ensuring she became a living warning to others. Guards themselves were rewarded for vigilance. If they recaptured a fugitive, they could claim her as personal property. And yet, even in such darkness, resistance persisted. Women shared knowledge of herbs that could prevent pregnancy or induce miscarriage. Others whispered fragments of Mongolian, hoping a few well-chosen words might soften a captor's cruelty. Protective networks formed, with stronger captives shielding the younger or weaker ones. These fragile acts of defiance preserved a shred of humanity amidst relentless dehumanization. The Tatars were the first to learn what systematic annihilation meant under Genghis Khan. After their defeat, he ordered every male taller than a wagon wheel executed, a height that included boys as young as 5. Their women and girls were parceled out among Mongol soldiers with specific instructions. They were to bear Mongol children. Within a generation, the Tatar bloodline existed only through female descent. Historians call this genetic genocide. The Mongols recognized that killing men erased armies, but controlling women erased entire peoples. This horrific template was refined against the Tangut kingdom. Here, the Mongols experimented with leaving some men alive, but castrated. These broken survivors were forced to watch as their wives and daughters were systematically impregnated by Mongol soldiers. The cruelty was deliberate, designed to destroy both bloodlines and spirits. Noble families endured especially targeted humiliation. Mongol commanders made a spectacle of raping princesses and aristocratic women in front of crowds. This not only shattered the dignity of the conquered elite, but also broadcasted the message that no rank or status could protect anyone from Mongol power. Royal daughters, who once symbolized dynastic pride, were reduced to camp followers, their lineage reduced to nothing more than a trophy. The numbers defy imagination. In the conquest of Merv, chroniclers record that each Mongol soldier was allotted between 300 and 400 women to rape and discard. In Nishapur, the quotas were even higher. These were not exaggerations born of rumor. Surviving Mongol records themselves track these distributions with the same meticulous detail they applied to livestock, horses, and weapons. Cities that surrendered were not spared. Instead, they faced a different system of violation. The Mongols would demand tribute in women, typically the daughters of the leading families. Publicly, these girls were described as gifts for the Khan's honor. Privately, everyone knew their true fate. Entire cities became complicit, forced to hand over their daughters to avoid complete annihilation. To process such staggering numbers of captives, the Mongols innovated. Outside major cities, they established what they chillingly termed selection centers. Here, women were sorted, inspected, and documented. Physicians checked them for health and fertility. Scribes entered their names, or numbers, into ledgers. The most beautiful and skilled were set aside for high-ranking Mongols. The rest were assigned down the hierarchy. Special categories existed for virgins, who were considered of highest value, and for women with rare skills, musicians, dancers, or weavers. Transportation required logistical planning on a scale rarely seen in pre-modern history. Specialized wagons were developed to move large numbers of women across thousands of miles. They were provisioned with just enough food and water to keep captives alive for redistribution. Guard units were specially trained in the management of female prisoners. Manuals taught them methods to suppress resistance, prevent suicide, and enforce order during transit. What resulted was a system that operated with the cold precision of a supply chain, but its cargo was human suffering. Chinese chroniclers preserved nauseating details of these quota systems. After conquering a region, Mongol administrators would calculate the number of women needed based on troop size. A tuman, an army unit of 10,000 soldiers, might be allocated 30,000 women. That was 3 per soldier, with extras reserved for officers. These allocations were recorded like rations of grain. The Mongols even categorized women into grades, reducing them to inventory. Grade A women, young virgins deemed especially beautiful, were reserved for the Khan and his inner circle. Grade B captives went to senior officers. Grades C and D were handed to common soldiers or relegated to camp labor. Surviving ledgers contained chilling entries. Received 234 Grade B females, distributed per attached list. Race and ethnicity were explicitly tracked. Administrators noted which women came from which conquered group, paying attention to perceived fertility rates. Persian women were often prized, Chinese women valued for their talents, Slavic women admired for their appearance. This was not just plunder, it was genetic planning. Even age was itemized. Girls younger than 12 were often raised in captivity until they were considered ready. Women aged 13 to 25 formed the primary breeding group. Those 26 to 35 were still subject to forced service, though sometimes spared the harshest demands. Women older than 35 were often forced into administrative or domestic roles, managing other captives, nursing pregnant women, or training the newly captured. Even the elderly were not spared exploitation. The Mongols' famed Yam postal system, stretching across Eurasia with way stations every 25-30 miles, became another network of exploitation. Officially, these stations provided horses and supplies for couriers. Unofficially, they became nodes in what one historian calls a rape highway. Each station was required to maintain a group of captive women for the use of passing travelers. Station masters filed reports complaining when entertainment was insufficient, just as they would complain about missing horses or supplies. Women were rotated between stations to provide variety for frequent officials. High-ranking Mongols could reserve specific captives in advance, turning human beings into scheduled appointments. Along major trade routes, the system grew even more elaborate. The Mongols built fortified rest houses where traveling nobles could pause for days. These were stocked not only with women, but also with captive musicians, dancers, and entertainers. What looked like orderly military logistics from the outside was, in truth, a vast machinery of organized sexual slavery. The infrastructure even supported itself through economics. Conquered territories were taxed not just in livestock or grain, but in women. Communities were assessed quotas and forced to deliver their daughters as though they were a form of currency. Those who failed to meet the Mongols' demands faced annihilation. Women too old or sick to serve as captives were forced into maintaining the facilities for the newer victims. The reach of this system was staggering. From China to Eastern Europe, no corner of the Mongol Empire was untouched. Archaeologists today have uncovered remnants of these stations, segregated quarters for women, crude medical rooms for treating venereal diseases, and burial grounds disproportionately filled with female remains. The bones themselves reveal the horror: malnutrition, repeated fractures, pregnancies at shockingly young ages. The integration of this system into imperial infrastructure meant that sexual slavery became as essential to Mongol governance as taxation or military service. Military brothels represented the institutional peak of Mongol sexual violence. These were not temporary or improvised setups, but purpose-built facilities designed to maintain army morale and reward loyalty. The largest were sprawling compounds, virtual cities, housing thousands of women, organized into districts by ethnicity, age, and specialty. Some were reserved exclusively for virgins, set aside for officers celebrating victories. Others held pregnant captives, as Mongol superstition claimed that sex with them brought luck in battle. Architectural plans survive for some of these facilities. They reveal barracks-style quarters for women, inspection chambers where soldiers selected their victims, treatment rooms for injuries and disease, and punishment cells for those who resisted. The layouts prioritized efficiency over humanity. Narrow corridors prevented escape. Tiny windows reduced suicide attempts. Centralized kitchens allowed drugged food to be distributed easily, keeping women compliant. The Mongols conscripted administrators from conquered populations to keep these facilities running. Chinese eunuchs, Persian merchants, and Arab scholars were pressed into service, forced to apply their talents to managing the empire's machinery of rape. They tracked supplies, maintained records, and even designed improvements for efficiency. One surviving manual describes in chilling detail how to break resistant women, maintain hygiene to prevent outbreaks, and maximize pregnancies. Some facilities specialized. Near military training camps, brothels existed to educate young soldiers. Near field hospitals, women trained in basic care were provided to service wounded warriors. These specializations proved how fully sexual violence was integrated into every corner of Mongol military life. The trauma inflicted reshaped entire civilizations. In China, the practice of foot binding accelerated, partly as families sought to make their daughters less mobile and therefore less likely to be taken. Architecture changed. Homes began including hidden chambers to conceal women. Wedding customs shifted as families married daughters at younger ages, hoping that married women might face slightly gentler treatment if captured. In the Islamic world, the practice of purdah intensified. Women who once lived relatively public lives retreated behind walls and veils. The hijab, once a symbol of status, became armor, a means of reducing visibility during raids. Urban neighborhoods restructured themselves, placing women's quarters in the most defensible parts of homes. Markets instituted separate hours for men and women, limiting exposure. Entire communities reshaped their way of life to reduce the risk of capture. The terror warped family structures as well. Protective infanticide became tragically common. Some families killed their baby daughters rather than let them grow up to face Mongol captivity. Others scarred their daughters' faces deliberately, hoping to make them less appealing to raiders. Beauty became a curse. Families arranged marriages earlier than ever, inserting divorce clauses that preemptively addressed what would happen if a bride was taken. The psychological scars endured for generations. Women who survived captivity often could not bond with children conceived through rape. These children were stigmatized, marked as belonging to both cultures and neither, carrying shame that was not their own. Communities invented cleansing rituals for women who returned from captivity, but many never reintegrated. Folk songs and lullabies preserved the memory, embedding warnings for girls: hide, run, or die before being taken. Modern genetic science has confirmed these horrors in stark numbers. Y chromosome studies reveal that around 16 million men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. That's 0.5% of the global male population, and as high as 8% in regions once ruled by the Mongols. This is not natural population growth. It is the genetic fingerprint of systematic sexual violence. The psychological scars endured for generations. Women who survived captivity often could not bond with children conceived through rape. These children were stigmatized, marked as belonging to both cultures and neither, carrying shame that was not their own. Communities invented cleansing rituals for women who returned from captivity, but many never reintegrated. Folk songs and lullabies preserved the memory, embedding warnings for girls: hide, run, or die before being taken. Modern genetic science has confirmed these horrors in stark numbers. Y chromosome studies reveal that around 16 million men alive today descend directly from Genghis Khan and his close male relatives. That's 0.5% of the global male population, and as high as 8% in regions once ruled by the Mongols. This is not natural population growth. It is the genetic fingerprint of systematic sexual violence. The patterns are even more shocking in specific regions. In parts of Central Asia, 34% of men carry genetic markers directly linked to the Mongol lineage. The distribution matches the roots of Mongol conquest with eerie precision, overlapping areas where historical accounts describe the most horrific atrocities. Every percentage point on those charts represents thousands of women violated, generation after generation, and Genghis Khan was not the only one. Genetic bottlenecks reveal the legacies of his brothers and sons who left behind their own widespread markers. Together, they carved trauma into the DNA of entire continents. In some conquered regions, genetic evidence suggests that virtually every woman of childbearing age was forced into bearing Mongol children. The scale is staggering. 16 million male descendants today likely means that more than 32 million people overall carry this legacy. And that only accounts for paternal lines. When maternal descent is factored in, the number doubles or triples. Hundreds of millions of people today carry ancestry born of coercion. The science has sparked painful debates. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is celebrated as a national hero. His image appears on currency. The international airport bears his name. Yet across Asia, millions live with the knowledge that their family lines began not with honor, but with atrocity. How do you reconcile national pride with ancestral violation? The paradox reaches beyond Mongolia itself. In Kazakhstan, some celebrate their partial Mongol blood as proof of warrior ancestry, while others view it as a genetic scar. The same man who unified tribes and built an empire left behind not only cultural and political legacies, but also one of the darkest genetic shadows in human history. Family genealogies that once traced proud lineages now reveal deeply uncomfortable truths. Modern DNA testing companies have even had to develop careful, almost diplomatic language for revealing these connections, acknowledging that what they identify often reflects historical trauma rather than voluntary unions. The genetic evidence has also uncovered patterns historians previously overlooked. Some regions show surprisingly low Mongol genetic impact despite detailed records of conquest. This suggests one of three possibilities. Either successful resistance, complete annihilation leaving no survivors, or perhaps that certain Mongol armies contained large numbers of non-Mongol allies who left different genetic markers. Conversely, areas with minimal surviving records show high Mongol genetic impact, exposing forgotten atrocities that never made it into the chronicles. Medical geneticists have found other haunting traces. Certain hereditary disorders appear with unusual frequency along Mongol conquest routes, consistent with population bottlenecks caused by mass killings and limited gene pools. Some groups display reduced genetic diversity, reflecting societies where most men were exterminated and women forced to reproduce with a handful of Mongol soldiers. The genetic data confirmed what survivors always knew in their bones. This was not random violence, but systematic genetic imperialism. The Mongol impact on human DNA represents perhaps the most horrifyingly effective form of biological warfare in recorded history. No other empire left such a clear genetic imprint of its crimes. The Romans conquered more territory, the British ruled longer, but neither empire fundamentally altered the genetic composition of entire continents. The Mongols did, through sexual violence elevated to official policy. Every new genetic study adds sharper detail to this nightmare. Molecular biology now provides the evidence that survivors' traumatized oral histories always insisted was true. And sometimes the data lines up with specific stories, allowing us to revisit legendary tales of resistance that, for centuries, hovered between myth and truth. One such story is that of Princess Gerbel of Tangut, whose name still resonates as a whispered defiance. In 1226, she entered Genghis Khan's household as part of tribute after her father's kingdom surrendered. Records describe her as beautiful but detached, speaking little and eating sparingly. Servants noted her constant habit of adjusting her elaborate hair, unaware that she was testing the hidden blades woven into those intricate styles. For 3 long years, Gerbel endured what thousands of women endured under the guise of concubinage. But unlike most, she had been raised in a warrior culture. Her father had insisted his daughters learn the sword alongside embroidery, believing women must be capable of defending themselves in a brutal world. Within the Khan's household, she watched, she waited, and she planned. She studied his rhythms, the way wine made him reckless, the nights when storms drove guards into shelter, the moments when arrogance dulled his caution. On the night of August 25th, 1227, all the conditions converged. A thunderstorm lashed the Mongol camp. The guards abandoned posts to escape the rain. The Khan, drunk on victory and wine, summoned Gerbal to his tent as he had countless times before. But this night was different. Gerbal had woven razor-sharp metal into her hairpins, testing them on silk to ensure they could cut not just fabric, but flesh. Accounts vary in their details, but all agree on the outcome. As Genghis Khan reached for her, Gerbal struck. The blade found its mark between his legs, severing the very organs he had used as instruments of conquest. His scream was drowned by thunder as she twisted the blade, ensuring mortal injury. Blood pooled on the silk cushions as the most feared man on earth collapsed. When dawn came, guards entered to find the Khan bleeding nearly to death, Girbal seated calmly beside him. She did not flee. She did not deny. When asked why, she reportedly replied, "He took my body for 3 years. I took his manhood in 3 seconds. The trade is fair." The guards executed her immediately, her body thrown to dogs. But her act created a crisis the Mongol elite could not resolve. How could the invincible Khan be felled by a woman's hand? Official scribes rushed to erase the truth. They declared he died from a fall from his horse, or from battle wounds, or from illness. Anything but this. For they understood that if women believed one of their own could kill the Khan, the myth of Mongol invincibility would crumble overnight. Yet truth has a way of moving faster than censorship. Servants whispered to other servants. Captive women passed the story through their quarters, each telling added details, perhaps exaggerations, but the core never wavered. The great predator of empires had been castrated by his prey. The story spread through the captive networks faster than official propaganda could suppress. It reached brothels from China to Persia. Women everywhere understood its meaning instantly. For Mongol leadership, damage control became urgent. They instituted new protocols. Concubines would be strip-searched, hairpins banned, access to the Khan tightly restricted. But fear had already entered their hearts. Every commander now wondered if tonight's conquest might end in his own death. Some became paranoid, executing women for imagined threats. Others doubled down on brutality, as if cruelty could rebuild their shattered aura of invulnerability. Yet the shift was undeniable. The predators had learned that they, too, could become prey. In conquered territories, Girbal became a folk hero. Songs composed in languages the Mongols couldn't understand celebrated her as the princess of the storm who cut down the tree at its root. Mothers whispered her story to daughters as both warning and inspiration. In hidden shrines, women left offerings to her memory, praying for her courage. Religious leaders declared her a martyr or saint, depending on their theology. The Mongol response was brutal but ineffective. They hunted down storytellers, destroyed shrines, executed anyone invoking Girbal's name. But repression only deepened her legend. She became symbol in strategy. Women across the empire began hiding blades in hair or garments. Others studied pressure points to disable men with quick strikes. The lesson was clear. Even in absolute captivity, there remained moments of choice for those willing to die on their own terms. Historians still debate her motivations. Was it years of patient planning or a single moment of desperate rage? Did she intend to inspire generations or simply end her own torment? The answers matter less than the consequences. One woman's act of defiance against history's greatest predator altered the empire itself. Her rebellion had measurable effects. Mongol commanders, shaken by the tale, became less inclined to keep personal concubines. Some shifted toward group-sharing policies, degrading but less individually risky. The structure of Mongol sexual exploitation endured, but its intensity dimmed. The absolute confidence, the unshakable aura of dominance, was gone. When Genghis Khan died, the empire did not collapse. It expanded further. Yet his successors inherited a changed system. Haunted by Girbal's ghost, they approached their captives with more caution. In China, Kublai Khan introduced slightly more regulated practices, perhaps influenced by Chinese bureaucracy, or perhaps recognizing that unrestrained violence hampered governance. In Persia and Central Asia, some commanders maintained extreme brutality, but now faced more coordinated resistance. Women formed whisper networks, shared poisons, and plotted escapes. Girbal's single act had shifted the balance. Not enough to end the horrors, but enough to remind the empire's victims that even within slavery, defiance was possible. Her story, buried under centuries of denial and propaganda, still stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of how one individual can weaponize despair into history-changing resistance. The knowledge that the great Khan himself had fallen to a woman's blade gave every captive a dangerous hope. The infrastructure of sexual slavery persisted for decades but gradually transformed. Military brothels shifted into civilian brothels. What had once been systematic genetic genocide gave way to more conventional systems of slavery. The Mongol Empire discovered what all empires eventually learn. Extreme brutality delivers diminishing returns. As the empire fractured, local populations reclaimed autonomy and immediately dismantled Mongol sexual slavery systems. Former brothels were burned in acts of symbolic vengeance. Mass graves of victims were uncovered and given proper burials. Communities created purification ritual to restore dignity to survivors. Mongol practices became what every conquered culture defined itself against, the ultimate evil that justified resistance at any cost. Yet the scars remained. Millions were born of rape, entire populations permanently marked by their origins. Cultural practices warped around avoiding Mongol predation, embedding trauma into the fabric of daily life. The legacy of Mongol violence raises uncomfortable questions about how we remember atrocity. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan remains celebrated as the great ancestor. His face appears on currency. His colossal statue towers over Ulaanbaatar. National historians emphasize his military genius, his legal codifications, his religious tolerance, while minimizing or reframing the empire's systematic sexual violence. This selective memory is not unique. Every culture sanitizes its heroes, but the genetic evidence makes denial harder, anchoring legend in biological reality. Cultural memory varies dramatically across geography. In Iran, Mongol devastation remains a historical trauma comparable in memory to the Holocaust for Jewish communities. In China, accounts acknowledge the brutality yet also credit the Mongols with reunifying the empire. In Russia, narratives emphasize military conquest while ignoring the sexual dimension. Each region shapes its remembrance to serve present political needs, even as survivors' voices fade into footnotes. Historians face significant challenges in documentation. Much of the evidence comes from victim populations who had every reason to exaggerate Mongol cruelty. Yet, genetic science has confirmed that the scale of the atrocities exceeded even the most horrific accounts. Archaeological evidence of mass graves, structural changes in architecture, and population crashes align with survivor testimonies. The convergence of evidence from multiple sources makes denial impossible, though interpretation remains contested. Modern parallels make this history painfully relevant. The rape camps of Bosnia, the exploitation of comfort women in World War II, ISIS's sexual slavery of Yazidi women, all echo Mongol practices. This is not ancient barbarism sealed in the past. It is a recurring feature of human cruelty. Understanding how the Mongols industrialized rape provides insight into recognizing and potentially preventing its modern iterations. Yet, the risk of sensationalizing remains ever present, with the danger of either glorifying perpetrators or commodifying victims' suffering. 8 centuries later, the Mongol genetic legacy stretches invisibly across continents. Every family gathering in Central Asia, every genetic test in China, every genealogy project in Eastern Europe carries the possibility of uncovering ties to history's most prolific sexual predator. The descendants did not choose this inheritance, yet they carry it in their blood. Some choose to interpret it as survival. Their ancestors endured the unendurable and carried life forward. But reconciling national pride with ancestral crimes remains fraught. In Mongolia, this conflict is particularly sharp. How do modern Mongolians balance reverence for the man who forged their nation with knowledge of the atrocities that shadow his reign? Some argue that historical context softens the judgment, that brutality was common in medieval warfare. Others point out that the scale and systematization of Mongol sexual violence dwarfed anything seen before or since. The genetic evidence turns abstract debates into personal realities. Even international relations feel these echoes. When Mongolia seeks closer ties with nations once subjugated, The historical memory complicates diplomacy. China's handling of its Mongolian minority involves careful management of narratives. Across Central Asia, national identities must reckon with Mongol cultural and genetic influences while insisting on distinct ethnic pride. The academic world also struggles. How do you teach Mongol history without minimizing the sexual violence, yet also without reducing an entire civilization to victimhood? How do you present genetic evidence without sliding into racial determinism? The challenge grows sharper when one considers that many students themselves may unknowingly carry this genetic legacy. Each teaching choice risks either sanitizing horror or re-traumatizing descendants. The Mongol case offers crucial lessons about human capacity for evil. It demonstrates how personal trauma can metastasize into genocidal policy when combined with absolute power. Genghis Khan's transformation from abandoned child to the most prolific rapist in human history was not inevitable, but it followed a dark logic of escalating violence and dehumanization. Modern psychology recognizes these patterns. Victims often become victimizers. The traumatized may seek control by traumatizing others. But individual psychology alone cannot explain the scale. The Mongol Empire constructed institutions, infrastructures, and ideologies that normalized mass sexual violence. Bureaucracy gave structure to brutality. Administrators, scribes, and guards allowed ordinary men to participate in extraordinary crimes. Each individual's role was subsumed into a machinery of systemic atrocity. For historians studying later genocides, the Mongol blueprint is disturbingly familiar. The Holocaust required railway schedulers. Rwanda's massacres depended on radio operators. Atrocity scales not through monsters alone, but through ordinary people performing specialized roles within monstrous systems. The Mongol Empire pioneered this bureaucratization of rape centuries before. Yet resistance also existed. For every Gerbil whose dramatic act of vengeance entered legend, thousands of unnamed women resisted in quieter ways. They shared herbal knowledge to prevent pregnancy, created hidden support networks, preserved cultural traditions under threat of obliteration, and raised children conceived in violence with unexpected love. Their heroism lacked dramatic flourish, but its cumulative effect was profound. They ensured that Mongol genetic imperialism failed its ultimate goal. Cultures survived, languages endured, traditions persisted. The ethical questions remain pressing. How do we honor victims without exploiting their pain? How do we study atrocity without becoming desensitized to its horror? The Mongol example resists easy answers. It was both exceptional in its scale and depressingly typical in its motivation. Time and again, human beings given unchecked power and an ideology of domination have chosen mass sexual violence as a weapon. The capacity lurks in our species, awaiting only the right conditions to surface. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson is complicity. The Mongol system required thousands of collaborators, administrators, guards, traders, doctors, scribes. Most were not Mongols, but conquered peoples who were either forced or chose to assist. The machinery of mass rape required accountants as much as soldiers. This bureaucratic spread of responsibility allowed atrocity to scale, making it eerily similar to later genocides. The parallels extend into modernity. Where Mongols used horses and scrolls, modern perpetrators used trucks and encrypted databases. Where Mongols built barracks for captives, modern armies build detention centers. The methods evolve, but the underlying logic remains constant. Recognizing these patterns offers the possibility of earlier intervention, though history shows political will too often lags behind recognition. The legacy of resistance is equally vital. Even within a system designed to crush autonomy, women found ways to fight back. Some scarred their own faces to make themselves less desirable. Families killed infant daughters rather than risk their capture. Communities built hidden chambers into their homes. Mothers sang lullabies encoding survival strategies for their daughters. Survival itself became defiance. The Mongol legacy also forces us to confront paradox. Millions today carry genetic proof of atrocity, yet they exist only because their ancestors endured and passed life forward. Each descendant embodies both horror and resilience, atrocity and survival. The past cannot be undone, but perhaps its lessons can prevent repetition. Gerbil's blade cut more than flesh. It sliced through the myth of Mongol invincibility. Her act revealed that even the most powerful tyrant could fall to one seemingly powerless victim. The story reverberated through time as a reminder that domination is never absolute. The powerful are never invulnerable, and the powerless never entirely helpless. The Mongol Empire eventually dissolved, but the scars it carved into human genetics and cultural memory remain indelible. From the kidnapping of Borte to the vengeance of Gerbil, the cycle of sexual violence defined an empire and destroyed millions of lives. Yet in the midst of this darkness, we also find resilience, small acts of humanity, and the survival of entire cultures against overwhelming odds. The women who endured captivity, who sheltered each other in camps, who whispered stories of resistance, who raised children born of violence with love. They are history's true heroes. Their names are lost, their lives largely unrecorded, but their collective courage preserved civilizations. They ensured Mongol genetic imperialism never achieved its ultimate aim. Today, as sexual violence and conflicts persists worldwide, the Mongol example stands as both warning and instruction. It shows how quickly atrocity can be normalized, how bureaucracy enables horror, and how ideology can weaponize personal trauma into mass policy. But it also proves that such systems inevitably contain the seeds of their own destruction. Every act of domination creates the potential for defiance. Every atrocity breeds its reckoning. Genghis Khan conquered more land than any man in history, but he died screaming from a woman's blade. His empire stretched from sunrise to sunset, yet it could not outlive the cut of a single hairpin wielded by a captive with nothing left to lose. The greatest conqueror in human history was ultimately conquered by one of his countless victims. In that reversal lies both justice and warning.